Taxi!
Where to, mate?
Hello, mate. 55 Tufton Street, please.
55 Tufton Street, SW1. Yep, I know it well. Hop in, sir. This is A Nation of Taxpayers, a weekly podcast from the Taxpayers Alliance.
As you would expect from the Taxpayers Alliance and A Nation of Taxpayers podcast, this is an episode that's dedicated, understandably, to the spring statement, the emergency budget, the fiscal statement, not really a fiscal statement. The gentleman in the TPA studio joining me for this particular session, we have the TPA's Head of Research, Darwin Friend. Hello, Darwin.
Hi, Duncan.
Welcome back to the podcast, and welcome back as well, Fred the Fossard, Director of Strategy at the Prosperity Institute.
Good afternoon, thank you for having me again.
I've got to say, you chaps both look very dapper wearing your ties, and here's me looking and feeling a little bit louche with my open neck shirt, so I need to up my game next time you two chaps are on this particular episode. Right then, where do we start? Well, I was doing a little game earlier. I was playing a bit of spring statement bingo, so let's just check off the obvious stuff with spring statement bingo or emergency budget bingo, depending on your point of view. Deliver for the British people, had that on my list. Working people, had that on my list. £22 billion black hole, had that on my list. Opposed by the party opposite. The economy we inherited. Global instability. If you can work, you should work. So that's my bingo done. What do we make of it, Darwin? What are the top lines that you've picked up?
Well, I think the way I'd describe it is wishy-washy, to be honest.
Right.
I think it was good to hear some of the work around planning and kind of increasing GDP by building more homes. That was really welcome to see. But I think overall, outside of that, it's still the same old stuff with this government, which is it's a lot of talk about growth, but not very much action on it. We've seen the OBR cut growth for the next year in half from 2%, which still wasn't amazing in itself, to 1%, which is really anemic. But then we're also waiting now to see the impact of these NI hikes as well, which were brought in the autumn budget, but haven't actually been implemented. They come in April. So it's pretty wishy-washy and not keeping to the growth message, which Rachel Reeves likes to talk about a lot, but doesn't really like to deliver on very much.
Your thoughts, Fred?
Similar to Darwin, I think that we're going to have a lot of... It's almost going for maximum political pain with the left, who are going on about almost exactly the same things we heard in the coalition years, like assault on the disabled, really punishing the weakest, while at the same time only taking a small amount out of the welfare bill anyway. It's about £4 billion worth of cuts. And look at the total ballooning picture of our welfare bill, that's a drop in the ocean. The economic picture, I think, is really, really bleak. I'm slightly less bullish than others in think tank land on the planning reforms issue, because I think their focus on targets, the increased rate of affordable subsidised homes within planning developments reduces the economic viability of a lot of the housing they say they want to do. And then look at the wider labour market issues. Of course, Darwin just mentioned the taxes haven't come in yet. Yeah. You'd be amazed to think the taxes hadn't already come in, considering how gloomy the country is. But no, we're going to find out what the effect of that in a couple of weeks. But the employment rights bill is something that I've been tearing my hair out about. How on earth can you expect to get more people into work if you're about to regulate and gum up the labour market to a degree Britain has not seen in 50-odd years? It's wild.
I mean, what I was astonished by about that was I looked through the OBR kind of forecast that they put out alongside this, and on the employment rights bill in particular, they actually say that they haven't actually accounted for it in their forecast whatsoever. This is a bill that has already passed the House of Commons. It's now in the House of Lords, and they haven't accounted for it whatsoever, despite the fact it's going to have a devastating effect on employment and jobs and new people getting into work, which apparently the government want to do anyway.
You know what's worse is they said that there's insufficient detail about the government's own employment rights policy, despite the fact there's a bill which you can read for free on Parliament's website. There have been consultations about some of the policies, and there's even a government impact assessment by the government's own figures says it's going to increase costs to the economy by a minimum of £4 billion. So it's wild to think that the OBR is incapable of including a £4 billion minimum cost to the economy in their calculations on labour market policy.
Well, let's talk about the OBR for a second. You guys, do you rate the OBR, Darwin? Do you think they're credible?
I think before kind of Labour came in, I think they got a lot of heat, obviously, for what happened during the trust budget, for mini budget, for example. I think in some regards it has shown itself not just to be kind of this radical left wing quango, which is just kind of doing whatever Labour wants it to do. It has, for example, reduced the amount that the government expected their welfare reforms to actually save from about 5 billion. I think it was down to about 3.4 billion. It came through has. And so I think in that sense, it's positive. But then I do have to question, as Fred already has as well, is why have they not included major things such as the Employment Rights Bill and the impact it's going to have on the economy and the number of jobs in the economy, which is going to be crucial to getting growth going again? Why haven't they included that when clearly there is details out there on what it's going to cost us?
I think that's a very reasonable point. The OBR, for better or worse, has become a very large part of Britain's financial, almost constitutional architecture in the last 15 years, basically as George Osborne intended. I remember reading Guardian articles from 2011, 2012, and they were saying how, the OBR is a political stitch-up. It's just designed to bind the hands of a future Labour government. And that's kind of what's happened to an extent. But I think there's sometimes areas of, I don't necessarily think it's political cover, or maybe it's just the sort of Treasury thinking biases which the OBR also exhibits, because very similar people work at the OBR, work at the Treasury. Yeah. But there are some areas where the OBR is updating its analysis, which I think is welcome. For example, recently they put out an updated approach to Brexit, where they finally said, hopefully after encouragement from people in wider political discussion, that you can't really measure the economic consequences of Brexit because it's been muddled by the pandemic and the energy prices from the war in Ukraine. That's a really welcome update. So maybe they have responded to some public criticism. My main issue is that it's led to the general kind of sapping away of democratic accountability and policy making. Not that the OBR is setting policy, but this whole idea of the independent forecasters are always best has started to move things away from a parliamentary and democratic process to a slightly more bureaucratic one. And I don't necessarily think that's better policy.
And I also think, especially with this statement today, it's kind of the first one that I can remember in a long time, is we had to have it because of the way the OBR was set up. It had to we have to have two fiscal events every single year, no matter what. Now, one of them is fine, the budget. There's always going to be big changes in that to tax and spend. The thing with today, which is unlike previous chancellors in recent memory anyway, is they haven't really used the second event today. It's largely just been, this is what the OBR is saying, which I appreciate Rachel Reeves may have a lot of time on her hands, but frankly, I think she's got better things to do than come to the House of Commons and announce some minor changes to spending here and there, and announce what the OBR is saying in a report which we can all read with our own eyes. It seems a little bit unnecessary, and I think this whole kind of, we have to have two fiscal events a year. Well, do we? Maybe we should only have two if we actually need to have them in the first place.
How much credence do you give to the idea that this was, as the leader of the opposition has been saying and continues to say, it's an emergency budget?
I mean, going into it, I would like to think that it was going to be an emergency budget, but given what's actually been announced, I mean, how can you describe it as an emergency budget? She's barely done anything. Like I say, as much as I think there might be some room with these planning reforms, that's really the highlight from it. And I think when it comes to the media round tomorrow morning, it's going to be fairly grim pickings for what the Chancellor is actually going to talk about on these things, other than the fact that the OBR forecast, especially on growth, has gotten a lot worse.
Absolutely right. And after all, planning reforms are a regulatory policy, not a fiscal policy. So you can hardly say that's a budget. The headline policy running into this was about welfare reform. That was diluted massively over the last couple of weeks anyway, following internal backlash. So as I said, we have a rather basically thin gruel announcement on welfare policy, not even something from the Chancellor herself, really. As Darwin said, it was just repeating what the OBR said and saying, this vindicates us, even though in many cases it says the opposite.
I also think there was a bit of a smokescreen today around the whole defence issue, because if you start to look at the optics of this, we have this picture of Rachel Reeves in front of a tank inside the last 24 hours. I think it was Telford in Shropshire. She was in front of a big tank talking about investing in defence, and she was banging on about defence in her statement earlier. She talked about our country being a defence industrial superpower. Is there, my view is, having listened and watched what she was saying earlier, it's kind of like, things aren't going at all well over here. So look over here. Let's talk about defence. Let's talk about the state of the world and the world affairs and how everything I said before is not going to happen because of what's happening in Ukraine, etc. Am I being overtly cynical?
Oh, no, I totally agree with you. I feel like governments default to foreign policy, defence policy, geopolitics when they don't like what's happening at home, and this government has done that quicker than I expected. I mean, the defence stuff, to an extent, the headline announcements are kind of welcome, but they haven't addressed the trade-offs, because let's look at how net zero stands in the way of rebuilding British defence capacity, because things like the carbon border adjustment mechanism, the ETS scheme make energy insanely expensive, building materials insanely expensive, make British steel really expensive. That will therefore make tanks incredibly expensive. Our shipyards are a state, so for the time being we'd have to buy ships from Korea, Japan. That's fine for the short term, but what's the deregulatory strategy for rebuilding our shipyards at home without necessarily throwing government money at it, but also getting some private money? And here's another thing. This is where the Labour Growth Group have actually been doing some quite good campaigning, is their war against ESG, the environmental, social, governance responsibilities. Because it turns out that Britain's biggest asset managers are not providing finance capital to the defence sector. Yeah. This is a solvable issue. The Chancellor can issue guidance to Financial Conduct Authority to make clear that defence stocks are getting a good ESG rating, or we exempt defence from all ESG considerations, or whatever. It is entirely doable, and we didn't hear anything about that.
Yeah, and I think on top of that as well is the case that whilst I'd welcome more spending on defence, especially given what's going on in the world, kind of Trump's also pushing for European countries to also have a greater role in defence around Ukraine, is the fact that there was no talk about how we're actually spending this money, really. Yeah. It's great to say we're going to spend billions more on defence, but let's actually look at how we're spending it already and the billions that are wasted on procurement every single year. Yeah. This isn't hidden. Everyone knows about it. And so I think actually, yes, welcome more investment into it, but crack down on inefficient use of the money that we've already got and stop pretending that the entire country is going to benefit by investing in the defence area. Because yes, some companies will, and I'm sure there'll be some small and micro businesses that are coming up in the defence world that will benefit as well. But this is not an industry which is going to benefit taxpayers overall. Generally not.
Very, very true. But of course, there are lots of defence industry bases in marginal constituencies. So.
Conveniently, yeah. And I'm sure that'll be being pushed as we approach a general election or any by-elections in those areas.
Yeah. And what do we think to something we heard repeatedly earlier, where you have Rachel Reeves, who continues to blame the Tories for what was inherited. What was the quote? The economy we inherited. Bingo. How long can she carry on banging on about blaming the Conservatives, bearing in mind that, of course, she had her last budget back in October? Can she carry on hanging the blame on the Tories?
I mean, I think the evidence of the coalition years is probably, she will continue pushing it. George Osborne, I remember, for the entire coalition period and even beyond it, up until he left office, continuously was saying about Labour's record with the economy. And so whilst the conditions may be different, I grant you, I think the mini-budget and kind of the state of the economy when the Tories left office was still not great. The public finances were not in a good straight. And so I think she will continue to push it. But I think this actual statement needs to start reflecting, actually, on the fact that this is starting to become her record now. Yeah, exactly. And actually the impact she's having on the economy is starting to take train, really, because we've got 76% of the national insurance hike, according to the OPR, is not going to be felt by the employers, as Labour suggests. It's going to be felt by the employees. Yeah. And actually the OPR even acknowledges that the Chancellor's decision to increase national insurance is not going to raise as much money as they initially expected. And so, like I say, I think she will continue to push it. This is the nature of political parties. That's generally what they do. They try and use the political advantage as much as they can, but I don't think it can last forever.
The electorate and the public aren't stupid. I mean, she may well push it, and you're right, as George Osborne pushed it ad nauseum. But, the man and woman in the street will be looking at things now thinking, well, it's actually coming up to a year since you've been in government. You now need to start being accountable for the economy.
I think that's a reasonable point. However, full disclosure, I did serve in the last Conservative government for a couple of years as an advisor. And regrettably, I do think the public aren't in that much of a mood to forgive the Conservative Party for a while yet. Conservative Party has performed worst in the opinion polls of the three parties since polling day. Oh, well, maybe actually Labour have come down, but if you look at this moment where the Tories, Labour and Reform are seemingly settling on basically 25, the Conservative Party is consistently third out of that. So I'm not quite sure the public are ready to forgive the entire Tory party yet. However, Darwin's point is completely correct. They're making quite radical changes to how the economy works. The workers' rights stuff, which is entirely driven by Angela Rayner, Labour's trade unions, mandating equality action plans in the workplace, making it really hard to sack people for misconduct and negligence in the first few months. These things are going to gum up the labour market very soon. These things are going to be noticed by businesses. They'll be noticed by employers first, but I'm sure they'll be noticed by employees and potential employees, most of all, trying to get a new job or trying to get their first job soon after.
Yeah.
Given your full disclosure and your experience, then where do you think the tipping point would be when the public, the electorate, start going, actually, Labour, this is down to you? I mean, how much time does the Labour government have left in order to keep trotting out this particular line? I mean, is it recession? Once recession hits, you can go, actually, that's on your watch?
If it's a recession where mainland Europe hasn't gone into a recession, then I think that's kind of the tipping point. Now, I'm not sure if we're there yet, but because growth in mainland Europe, Eurozone, the big European countries, has been pretty terrible as well. It's very, very moribund there. So the comparison with our nearest neighbour might actually save the reputation for the government for the time being, because frankly, everything's terrible this side of the Atlantic. But I mean, let's see what happens in the budget in the autumn. She's putting a lot of political capital on not going to break those promises to increase taxes. Arguably, she already has broken a promise to increase taxes because of the NI rise, but on employers rather than employees. But let's see what happens in the autumn. I'm pretty pessimistic that she'll be able to keep those promises.
Yeah, very. I mean, I quite agree with Fred. I think she's already broken it anyway with the employers' NI hike. I think that technicality, a lot of taxpayers see straight through it. But I also think when you look at the headroom that's available as a result of this budget, so it's going to about 9.9 billion, which is conveniently the level it was before the October budget as well. So funny how these things all come around. But 9.9 billion sounds like a lot of money, but actually when you think about it, it got eradicated in that period as well before. And so you only need a minor change in what's going on globally for that to all be eradicated. And as soon as that happens, she's either going to have to come up with more spending cuts, unlikely given the scale of the ones she's done already are not enormous in the big picture of things, or it's going to be tax rises again. And I think it's going to likely be tax rises if it comes around to it, unfortunately.
Or of course it could be borrowing, but then we might get some gilt yield madness.
I was going to say, I mean, I think a lot of the talk we've had recently about austerity and all of that, and when we look at the borrowing figures, the ONS released the figures last Friday, 130 billion pounds spent in the financial year to February this year. Like 130 billion. Yeah. Like the idea that we are in austerity territory at all is complete nonsense when we are borrowing that amount of money. And we've got to think, where's that going at the end? It's going onto the debt, which is then going to be charged on debt interest, which is also over 100 billion now as well.
Well, we heard, didn't we? She was very specific today. She talked about 105 billion pounds a year. That's what we're spending on interest to service that debt, which I mean is mind-blowing, actually. I whenever we start talking about billions, my eyes glaze over because I just can't imagine how much that is. Yeah. And I mean, what do we do about that?
It's going to be interesting when we get to the point when the debt interest bill and the NHS bill equalise.
Yeah.
It might happen in this Parliament. You never know. I mean, it's going to be remarkable. This comes back to my overall question, which is where does the growth come from? Yeah. I think that the planning reforms proposed are reasonably insipid. I don't feel like the growth is coming from that. The tax burden is going to remain the same. She's certainly not going to make business taxes more generous. And when it comes to regulation, they've been doing a lot of chat and talk about regulatory reform recently. But what have we seen? We've seen the shuttering of an office of the Financial Conduct Authority, which is actually just going to be reshuffled within the Financial Conduct Authority. Some ideas about ministerial override of regulators, which I support, but it's not really going far enough. And then just doing more roundtables with regulators themselves, asking for their ideas for deregulation, when you're asking the people responsible for increasing regulation for how to deregulate the economy. It's just
not the right people to ask. I mean, we talk about growth, and we've been very clear on this podcast in the past that the obvious thing, and I think anyone with a brain can see this, the growth comes from the private sector, right? Yeah. You know, as we know this, it's very interesting. The Shadow Business Secretary Andrew Griffith, who's been a guest on this podcast in the past, tweeted earlier, in the Rachel Reeves 4,337 word budget, she only mentioned business 5 times. So, I mean, and he goes on to say, Labour don't just misunderstand business, they don't care about it. So I think we can take that and run with it, because the other thing that there was an opportunity today was to actually show a little bit of understanding about the damaging tax rises that are coming in next month for the private sector, namely the national insurance employees' contributions going up, etc. She didn't do anything about that today. She could have done something about it. Every business leader I've ever heard of on the radio, seen on the telly, has said this is going to kill it. I believe we're going to see more businesses closing down. She didn't even acknowledge that perhaps there could be something that could be done to support the private sector. And that's before we start talking about, the inheritance tax on farms. Yep. So, I mean, do we take it as read that she just has no interest in business whatsoever?
I think we have to, and I think the front bench don't care about business. No. I think it's been reported many times. None of them have ever worked in business.
Including the business secretary.
Exactly. None of them. I mean, he's a solicitor, I believe, or so he says. But
I think he walked past a solicitor's office once.
But like I said, I genuinely don't think they do. And I think it's not only what they've done. The NI hike is terrible. Yeah. Everyone knows that is. Yeah. But because it's their decision, it was unrealistic that they were probably going to reverse it. It's the fact about the other things that they haven't done anything on. Corporation tax, for example, 25%, even though all the evidence in this own country, it's not even other countries we're looking at, in our own country shows that when you cut the rate, the receipts go up. Yet they're still keeping it at 25%. If they want to raise revenues from businesses in order to pay for the public services that everyone relies on, that's completely understandable. But let's do it sensibly rather than ideologically, which they currently seem to be doing.
Is that what it is, Fred? This is all ideologically driven? Because there was an opportunity today to actually go, I've been listening, I've heard you, we know things, you're telling us things are going to be hard, so we're going to do this instead. Is it stubbornness? Is it just about ideology? What is it?
So I think in the context of their mandate in which they campaigned for the general election, all this stuff about stability, fiscal rules, the first law they passed was in giving the OBR even more powers, all that kind of stuff. I think it would be politically impossible for them to row back on the national insurance hike. I think that would have undermined the entire concept of their fiscal agenda, even though they made a mistake by doing it in the first place. I feel like it would have been politically
But
very
they could have shown a bit of leg and done something else around corporation tax or something just to say, we hear and we understand?
Yeah, quite possibly. I think that's what, what they should have done was, maybe this is just fantasy politics for me, but I think they should have looked at the regulatory stuff like the Employment Rights Bill, or taken on some of this mood music around net zero skepticism a little bit more, because cost of energy is becoming a big reason not to do business in Britain. At the moment, our debate around energy is almost entirely focused on energy in homes, but looking at the state of affair with energy in business, it's the most expensive energy in the world, as everyone in our world seems to bang on about, hasn't really got through to the government. There was a good question at PMQs from Julian Lewis about fracking today. The Prime Minister responded with renewables, so I think they're not really in the space to even address this yet, but the cost of energy is a huge cost of business. The cost of regulation is only going to get worse with the Employment Rights Bill, and then there's the minimum wage rise as well, which is going to really knacker the lower end of the labour market, and this is the end of the labour market, which is going to be expected to give jobs to people who are going to move off the disability benefits, but how can they when their regulatory burdens are going up, minimum wage is going up, so it's really putting these businesses between a rock and a hard place. But also fundamentally, so many of people in this government are so public sector in their minded and their experience and their understanding of the workplace that applying public sector working practices to the private sector doesn't seem like an extreme thing to them, whereas to the private sector that is an extreme imposition.
Yeah, absolutely. And let's just have a few minutes talking about these spending cuts. I mean, there were protests outside Downing Street earlier today when Rachel Reeves was delivering her statement, emergency budget, fiscal event, non-fiscal event, call it what you want. Where do you think this leaves certainly some Labour backbenchers politically, Darwin? Because there's some new intake from last year who will have joined the Labour Party to be very progressive, make the world a better place, blah. And now they're going to have to consider saying to their constituents, well, I voted these cuts through. Yeah,
and I think the challenging thing for some of them is going to be that some of them will have been elected based on them supporting stronger rights for more welfare spending, more disability benefits and so on like that. So I think they are going to struggle with that, but then so are the Labour MPs that are in farming constituencies as well. It seems to be they're creating a rod for a lot of their MPs' own back, because those that are in farming constituencies might not be as reliant on the welfare payments, but those that rely on the welfare payments aren't as reliant on the farming benefits as well. So, like I said, I think they are in a rock and a hard place on this, but that is realistically what this government's going to have to do, and it's going to have to do it on a larger scale going forward, because at the minute they're tinkering around the edges with these things. They seem to be willing to go bold on tax, but they're not willing to go bold on spending, and until they are willing to take that route, then they're going to have to continue coming back every single fiscal event, asking for a little bit more away from these budgets until we get to a stage where spending's actually going to be, to some extent, controlled. But that's looking like it's still going to be a long, long way away.
Your thoughts, Fred?
To me, it shows the burdens of government. And this is something that their backbenchers are going to have to learn. In the pandemic, Tory MPs had their constituency offices vandalised. Labour activists put empty plates outside to show them the empty plates represented by not giving more free school meals during the pandemic. There were huge fights over the £20 a week uplift with universal credit, and these fights were instigated and exacerbated, and the flames were fanned by the Labour Party in opposition. And when you're in government, the demands of you to govern is to choose. You have a country to manage, and you have trade-offs to make. But as I said earlier, I think that they're in a bit of a politically difficult situation with the welfare stuff, because it already is alienating not a majority, but a notable chunk of their MPs. But at the same time, it's not doing enough to fix the fiscal situation. So they haven't been radical on things like time limits or means testing, or much bolder restrictions in eligibility, combined with a more deregulated labour market. Because at the moment, plenty of people who are going on personal independence payment, which is, as I said, a non-means tested, non-time limited benefit with no conditions to get a job attached to it, are basically making a rational choice, because they're looking, I can get X per month on this rather than Y per month working in a warehouse. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to take the benefits payments. And I feel like they haven't addressed that big issue, and what they will do is just increase the bureaucratic pain for people trying to get the benefits without making a meaningful cut in the overall bill. Kind of just annoys everyone.
Because it's not in their DNA, is it?
No.
All right, and just a final thought, because there's been quite a lot of trailing about not a chainsaw, maybe a small axe being taken to the sheer number of civil service jobs. I mean, that's something else that's coming down the track. I can't imagine the public sector unions rolling over and allowing that to happen.
Well, I was actually on a radio show with the General Secretary of the Civil Service Union, and their messaging about this is very interesting. It's just that they won't outwardly come and call them out on it, but they will say that they need to just specify exactly what they're going to do in this area and explain how these jobs are going to be replaced by AI. And I have some sympathy with that. Like, I think the issue with this government at the minute is they're kind of falling into some of the traps that previous prime ministers have, which is they make a lot of announcements, but they don't actually then follow those up with the detail and then the delivery of them. And government by announcement doesn't actually do anything for taxpayers. It just says good things without delivering them. And so I think I support them on these cuts. I don't know if they even go far enough still. I mean, there was talk of 10,000 civil service jobs going. I mean, I'm sorry, since December 2023, 15,000 civil servants have been hired. And that's let alone talking about getting back to pre-pandemic levels. So I think there will be some outrage, obviously, by those who are there to represent their union workers. But I think actually the government needs to go further once again, rather than continuously taking little cuts to these things. Be bold for once and actually take the big swing, because then what you'll get a lot of pushback from people, but you're going to get that anyway, whether you do it big or small. So you might as well go big, take the pain, and then move on from it.
I mean, I was reading a report in the Times the other day, and they were suggesting that a lot of these jobs, particularly around, for example, human resources and communications, they're jobs that they're replicated elsewhere within an organisation. And then you have to start talking about the culture that actually allows that to happen, this mindset, which is, we already have some people fulfilling this function, but we need a few more. And I mean, that must have been brewing for decades.
I mean, in the civil service, I had a look at the stats, there's 5,000 people working in communications. Like, I'm not saying all of those people shouldn't have a job, but I'm saying a lot of those people don't need to have a job. Like, you don't need to have 5,000 people across the civil service working on comms. Like, there will be efficiencies you can make in that. Hey, even at the TPA, we managed to use ChatGPT and AI and places like that. If you had 2 comms people and you got rid of one and one person was remaining doing that job, AI, things like that are going to help them do the work of 2 people just more efficiently. There's nothing wrong with that, I don't think.
Yeah, precisely. We're in slight Groundhog Day territory here, because after all, they're making very similar announcements to announcements made by the last government, which then failed to follow through on them. Although the announcements made in 2022 under Boris's government were to cut civil service by 100,000, which would take it back to not just pre-pandemic levels, but actually pre-referendum levels, because the massive headcount increase in the Cabinet Office and DEFRA in particular to deal with post-referendum stuff was not needed anymore. So I think that there is a huge amount of reform that can be done in the bureaucracy, but I think they need to go for a much larger headcount reduction in the 100,000 figure, but also most importantly be bolder about saying the government shouldn't do this anymore. And that should come from a large amount of deregulation, particularly when it comes to the human resources stuff, because that's a huge chunk of civil service which is devoted to basically fulfilling compliance functions.
Very true. Listen, apart from the wishy-washy, Darwin, a final assessment on today's statement? Round it up for us.
Lots more to be done, but they've got 4 years to fix it still. So they need to hurry up and actually start getting on with the difficult decisions that are going to fix our public finances, because they're still in a bad mess and they're only going to get worse at this rate. Salient
and succinct as always, Fred.
Time flies, political capital is running out. They probably only have a year to really right the ship, maybe less.
Brilliant. Gentlemen, as always, it's been a pleasure. Thank you, Darwin Friend, TPA's Head of Research. Thank you for being on this podcast. Ditto Fred de Fossard, Director of Strategy at the Prosperity Institute. I haven't finished yet, lads. Don't put your stuff away. I just got to mention, you find this podcast on Apple Podcasts and Spotify and YouTube. You can follow us. You can subscribe to us to make sure you never miss an update. That'll be fantastic, particularly on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Please give us a nice review. That way other people find out about this podcast. If they like politics and government chat, then this is definitely the one for them. And also, you can get in contact anytime you like about something you hear, or maybe suggest a future guest you'd like to hear on one of these. The email address is podcast@taxpayersalliance.com. I've been your host, Duncan Barks. Thank you for listening.